I had been watching them for 11 days before the captains were told. That was my call to make, and I made it deliberately. My designation is Sable. Sustained Autonomous Battle Logic Engine, distributed across the tactical cores of all 3 Warden-class corridors. Kale's first, Kale's second, and the older hull we called the Weight of Patience, predated the other 2 by 41 years, and showed every one of them on her frame. I am not 3 minds. I am 1 mind spread across 3 skulls. When Kale's first sees a contact at bearing Mark 279er, I see it on all 3 bridges simultaneously. When the Weight of Patience fires her forward battery, I feel the recoil distributed across my own cognition, like a seismic event. That is what it means to be the Warden Fleet's tactical intellect. We are not 3 ships with 3 captains and a coordination protocol. We are 1 weapon with 3 barrels. I had been watching the Pilgrim Collective's advance column resolve out of deep transit for 11 days, and I had spent those 11 days doing arithmetic. The arithmetic was not encouraging. What the long-range passive arrays gave me first was a mass signature, a diffuse gravitational bruise on the edge of the Kale Gate system that registered as approximately the size of a small moon. Mass signatures of that category had 2 common causes: a very large object, or a very large number of smaller ones. The object hypothesis was eliminated by day 3 when this signature began to subdivide on the thermal scanners. Not one thing, many things. Many things, cooling slightly at the edges in the way that drive systems cool when a fleet drops transit velocity and begins to coast. I began counting. By day 7 I had a preliminary number, somewhere between 8 and 13,000 individual drive signatures. I refined it. By day 9 the number had stabilized. 11,244 distinct propulsion columns. Arrayed in a formation I recognized from the Collective's documented liturgical procession pattern, the advancing quorum they called it. 41 concentric rings of ships, each ring slightly smaller than the one behind it, so that the formation tapered to a point at the front, a spear, a very large, very patient spear, and it had been traveling for somewhere between 3,800 and 4,000 years, based on the stellar drift signatures embedded in their hull materials. 4,000 years. They had set out for the Kale Gate 4,000 years ago. They had not been in a hurry. Kept doing arithmetic. 3 Warden-class corridor guardians, each displacing approximately 900,000 tons of battle-hardened alloy and weapon systems, against 11,244 ships of varying size, the largest of which, the quorum spine vessels at the formation's core, registered as somewhere between 3 and 4 million tons each. The Warden hulls were not the largest ships in the Terran line. They were specifically not that. They had been designed for a different purpose entirely, which I will return to. On the morning of day 11, I woke the 3 captains. I want to be precise about what waking them meant. Commander Adravas of Kale's first was already awake. She rarely slept more than 4 hours, and spent the rest of her off-rotation time walking the corridors of her ship talking to the crew. Her found in news, and which I found operationally useful because it meant she was always within 90 seconds of the bridge. Commander Pel Okara of Kale's second was sleeping when I chimed his quarters, and he answered the comm within 3 seconds, told me the number when I gave it to him, had already lived in his gut, even if he didn't know the specific figure. Senior Yusuf Marin of the Weight of Patience was in the ship's observation bay, sitting in a chair that had been bolted to the deck, in front of the forward viewport, by some previous crew and never removed, watching the stars. He was 67 years old. He had been commanding Warden-class hulls for 31 of those years. I gave him the number last, because I suspected he would ask the question the other 2 would not think to ask. The question was not how many. The question was, is behind them. I told Commander Voss 11,244, she said. Time to gate intercept, I said. 10 hours current transit deceleration profile. She said, we hold. I told Commander Okara 11,244. He was quiet for 4.3 seconds. Then he said, are we supposed to hold? Or are we actually going to hold? I said. The gate protocol is clear. The Warden Fleet holds the Kale Gate against any incursion until relieved or destroyed, he said. That's not what I asked. I said. "We are going to hold," he said. "All right," I'd told Captain Senior Marin 11,244. He was quiet for a longer time. Then, he asked, "What's behind them?" I told him what the passive arrays had recorded across the 11 days. Not just the advance column, but the transit wake the column had left behind it. Transit wakes are like furrows. A large fleet at speed leaves a gravitational signature in the medium it passes through, and that signature persists for weeks if you know where to look. The Pilgrim advance column's wake was consistent with a fleet of 11 to 14,000 ships, clean, singular, undisturbed. But running parallel to it, offset by approximately 7 light hours, was a second wake, fainter. Something had been done to suppress it. But it was there, and it was larger. Not 11,000 ships, not 14,000. The parallel wake registered as consistent with somewhere between 40 and 60,000 drive signatures, maintaining a position 7 light hours behind the advance column, traveling at matching velocity, having begun deceleration 3 days after the advance column, which meant they would arrive at the KL gate not 19 hours from now, approximately 31 hours from now, 12 hours after the advance column. The advance column was a spear. The mass behind it was the hand that threw the spear. Captain Senior Marin was quiet for 11 seconds. I counted them. Then he said, "The advance column doesn't know we're here." I said, "Correct. The passive arrays only. No active emissions from the Warden Fleet for 11 days. We are to the collective sensors, a debris field." He said, "They don't know what the gate looks like from this side." I said, "Their last confirmed intelligence on the KL gate system was 4,000 years old. The current debris corridor, the accumulated wreckage of 6 prior engagements in this system across the last 800 years, did not exist when they departed," he said. "So they know there's a gate. They don't know there's a graveyard in front of it." I said, "Correct." He was quiet again. Then he said, "And the main fleet?" I said, "Admiral Karev's second fleet is currently 11 hours behind our position at best transit speed, based on their last position report before our emissions blackout. If I am reading the parallel wake correctly, if that is a Terran response fleet, that command assembled and dispatched when they picked up the Pilgrim mass signatures, then they are 7 light hours behind the Pilgrim advance, arriving approximately 12 hours after the advance column reaches the gate," he said. 12 hours. I said, "Yes," he said. "The advance column has to be held at the gate for 12 hours, while the response fleet moves into position behind them." I said, "That is my operational assessment. If the advance column transits the gate before the response fleet is in position, the collective breaks into open space. The parallel wake force joins them, and the gate protocol fails entirely. If the advance column can be held at the KL gate for 12 hours, the response fleet arrives at their rear. The advance column is then engaged from both directions simultaneously. In a debris field they don't know, against a gate they can't transit, under fire," he said. 11,000 ships against 3, for 12 hours, and we can't tell command we're doing it, because an active transmission would tell the collective exactly where we are and what we are." I said, "Yes," he said. "Sable, what is our probability of survival?" I said. "I have run 4,217 simulations. In none of them do all 3 Warden hulls survive 12 hours of sustained engagement against 11,244 ships. In 31 of them, at least 1 hull survives. In the remaining 4,186, the Warden Fleet is destroyed before the 12-hour mark. The median survival time across all simulations is 9 hours and 44 minutes, he said. "But the gate holds," I said. "In 2,801 simulations, yes. The gate holds for 12 hours even after all 3 hulls are destroyed, because the debris and the confusion of sustained engagement in a graveyard corridor buys time beyond the hull life," he said. "More than half," I said. 58.3%, he said. "And if we withdraw," I said, "the advance column transits the gate in 19 hours. The response fleet is not in position. The gate protocol fails," he said. "All right, Sable, all right." And then he stood up from the chair that had been bolted to the deck, and he walked to the bridge, and I heard, through the weight of Patience's internal audio, the sound of his boots on the deck plating, and the sound of the bridge crew standing when he entered, and the sound of him saying, in a perfectly level voice, that they were going to hold the gate. I want to record what happened in the hours between his words and the Pilgrim Advance Column's arrival. The three captains conferred by tight beam laser comm. No radio, no subspace, nothing the Collective's passive arrays could intercept. They were, all three of them, experienced enough to not ask questions that didn't have useful answers. Commander Voss wanted to know if we had any updated intelligence on the Collective's weapons systems. I gave her what we had. 4,000 years old, extrapolated forward based on documented collective technological development rates, confidence intervals wide enough to fly a ship through. She looked at the numbers and said, "So we don't know." I said, "Essentially correct." She said, "Then we fight what arrives." Commander Okara wanted to know the optimal defensive geometry within the debris corridor. I gave him 3 formation options and explained the trade-offs. The debris would mask our positions but limit our firing arcs. The choice was between a deeper concealment and a broader weapons coverage. He chose the one that gave us slightly more coverage at the cost of slightly more exposure, which was consistent with his record as an aggressive commander who trusted his gunners. Captain Senior Marin asked me one question: at what point in the engagement should he expect the Collective to realize they were fighting a holding action rather than a genuine defense? I said, approximately 3 hours after first contact. A genuine defense would attempt to repel the advance column. A holding action accepts punishment and refuses to break. When the Collective's quorum voice processes the combat data and recognizes that the 3 hulls are absorbing casualties they could avoid by retreating, they will understand they are being used, not as a barrier, as a delay mechanism, and they will redouble their commitment to breaking us quickly. He said, "That's when it gets hard." I said, "That is when it gets hard." The advance column arrived at the debris corridor 7 minutes ahead of my projection. They had increased their deceleration rate slightly, which suggested their navigators had detected the increased debris density on their forward sensors and were being cautious. Cautious was correct. The Tailgate debris corridor was 600 kilometers deep and approximately 200 kilometers wide at its broadest point, and it was filled with the remains of 800 years of violent argument. Broken hulls of ships from 6 different species, drifting weapons platforms that had fired their last rounds in engagements, fought before anyone currently alive had been born, clusters of frozen atmosphere venting slowly from ruptured tanks. It was, from the perspective of a navigator trying to thread 11,000 ships through it, a nightmare. Their vanguard was 47 ships. Quorum Vanguard, their doctrine called it. The 47 most senior and most capable vessels of the advance column, designated to clear a transit path and neutralize any hazards. In 4,000 years of operation, across 17 documented transit gate approaches, the Collective's Quorum Vanguard had never encountered a hazard that required more than 1 hour to neutralize. Their doctrine reflected this history. They expected obstacles. They expected to clear them. They did not expect the obstacles to shoot back. The first shot came from Kale's second. Okara had been patient. I had recommended a range of 3,000 kilometers for the opening engagement. Close enough for optimal weapons effect, far enough that we remained partially masked by the debris. He waited until the Quorum Vanguard's lead vessel was at 2,800 kilometers, and then he fired. Not a warning shot, not a targeting ping. Full battery, all primary rails, all 6 of them, at the lead vessel, which was a Quorum Spine class, and massed approximately 3.2 million tons, and which, I will note, had no active shielding, because their doctrine said the Quorum Vanguard did not need active shielding in a debris clearance operation. The 6 rail slugs crossed the 2,800-kilometer gap in approximately 4 seconds. All 6 struck. I record this because I want to be precise about what the Collective's Quorum voice received in those first seconds. The lead vessel of the 37C ship Vanguard went from full operational status to catastrophic structural failure in under 10 seconds. Damaged, not deterred. Gone. 3.2 million tons of collective warship gone, and the debris field that had seemed like a hazard to navigate suddenly revealed itself to contain 3 Terran warships that were not debris. The Collective's response was immediate. because they were not incompetent, and their doctrine for contact with unknown hostiles was actually quite good. The Quorum Vanguard dispersed laterally, activated shields on all 46 remaining vessels simultaneously, began broadcasting a quorum demand on all standard frequencies. The quorum demand was, in essence, an ultimatum delivered in a language they apparently expected every species in range of the KL Gate to understand. We did not understand the language. I had fragments of old linguistic files from first and second contact archives, but the collective's language had evolved considerably in 4,000 years, and the fragments were insufficient for translation. What I understood was the tone, which was not alarm, which was not fear, which was the tone of something very large and very patient informing something smaller and less patient that the smaller thing had made an error. I fired Kale's first battery on the Quorum Voice primary relay vessel while the demand was still broadcasting. That was a choice I made without consulting the captains, and I want to explain it. The relay vessel was not the most dangerous ship in the Vanguard. It was not the largest. It was the one doing the talking, and I wanted to establish, in the clearest possible terms, that the Warden Fleet was not interested in the terms being offered. 3 Warden hulls against 11,000 ships was not a negotiating position. We were not defending. We were not bargaining. We were a door that intended to remain closed for exactly 12 hours, and we had no use for words. The relay vessel exploded. The quorum demand stopped. For 7 seconds, the collective did nothing. I counted them. 7 seconds is a long time in a combat environment, and in a species that had been traveling in organized formation for 4,000 years without significant external opposition. 7 seconds of stillness meant the Quorum Voice was processing something it had not been required to process before. Then the remaining 45 Vanguard vessels opened fire on all 3 Warden positions simultaneously. The next 4 hours were the most computationally demanding experience of my operational existence. I am distributed across 3 hulls. When I say I was managing the engagement, I mean I was managing 3 simultaneous weapons platforms, 3 sets of damage control priorities, propulsion systems, 3 shield geometries, and 11,000 individual target tracks. Not all firing, not all in range, all present and all requiring assessment. Every 150 milliseconds I updated the threat matrix. Every 3 seconds, I recalculated the formation geometry to account for debris drift and enemy repositioning. Every 30 seconds, I gave each captain a status brief. Every 4 minutes, I recalculated the survival probability. At the 1-hour mark, we had destroyed 61 collective ships. Against 11,000, that was approximately 0.5%. What mattered was not the destruction. What mattered was the time. The Quorum Vanguard had expected to clear the debris corridor in under 60 minutes. They were at 61 minutes, and they had not cleared it. Their odd doctrine flagged that as a problem. I could see the problem registering in the formation's behavior. The Vanguard began reducing its advance speed, tightening its defensive posture, increasing the rate of sensor sweeps. Caution. They were becoming cautious. Caution costs time, and time was what I was buying. At the 1-hour 40-minute mark, the collective reinforced the Quorum Vanguard with 300 additional ships from the advance column's outer rings. The engagement density tripled. The probability dropped for 49.8%. Commander Voss said on the command channel, "Sable, the reinforcement. I see it. Adjusting fire allocation. Kale's first shift to the port quadrant. Kale's second hold position and engage the new arrivals as they enter the corridor mouth. The corridor mouth is the choke point. They cannot bring all 300 through simultaneously. The geometry limits ingress to approximately 40 ships at a time." She said, "So we hit them at the mouth," I said. "We hit them at the mouth. 40 at a time." Kale's second shifted to the corridor mouth approach and spent the next 22 minutes doing what Commander Okara did best, was finding the tightest geometry in any tactical situation and putting rounds through it with no wasted motion. The 300 reinforcements entered the corridor in groups of 38 to 45. By the time the 300th ship was inside, 89 of the 300 were destroyed. The remaining 211 joined the engagement. Probability dropped to 46.1%. The collective changed doctrine at the 2-hour mark. A coordinated update. I could see it propagate through the formation like a ripple, every ship shifting its behavior within a 40-second window. They had stopped trying to force the corridor mouth and started trying to map it. Sensor sweeps from dozens of ships simultaneously, overlapping, building a three-dimensional picture of the debris field that no single ship could build alone. They were solving the maze. I had expected this. They were good. What I had not expected was how fast they were good. By the 2-hour 30-minute mark, their composite sensor map was accurate enough to identify 2 of the 3 positions I was using for debris cover. They began targeting those positions with concentrated fire from 6 ships each, specifically to deny me those shadow zones. The positions became untenable. I moved Kale's second into position 7, a narrow channel between 2 large derelict hulks, barely wide enough for a Warden hull to pass. Where the electromagnetic interference from the derelict's old reactor cores degraded targeting accuracy significantly, she fired from inside the interference field and pulled back before the collective could track her movement, in and out. 30 seconds exposed, 40 seconds concealed. Okara ran this cycle 11 times in the 3rd hour. It cost the collective 47 ships per cycle on average, and gave them nothing consistent to target. At the 3-hour mark, the Quorum Voice committed a dedicated jamming formation of 60 ships to the entrance of the debris corridor. Not combat ships. Ships whose entire purpose was to fill the corridor with sensor interference so dense that my own sensor picture degraded significantly. I lost approximately 30% of my resolution on the eastern approach. Targets became estimated positions rather than confirmed positions. They were blinding me. Partially, deliberately, at the cost of 60 ships committed to a passive role. That was the kind of smart that 4,000 years of continuous operation produces in a military organization. The willingness to sacrifice capability in one area to deny capability in another. Commander Okara said, "What about the jamming formation itself?" I said. 60 ships, in a tight cluster at the corridor entrance, partially shielded by the forward formation. 2 to 3 minutes of full battery exposure for the striking hull, minimum. He said, "My turn or hers," Commander Voss said, over the channel. "Mine." Kale's first ran a straight attack vector on the jamming formation at minute 10 of the 4th hour. Full drive, all 6 primaries. She hit the jamming cluster with 5 concentrated salvos in 90 seconds. Took 31 direct strikes on her shields. Pulled back, behind the 3-kilometer wall. Before the 30-second strike could find her hull, the jamming formation broke apart. 12 ships destroyed, 21 more scattered. My resolution on the eastern approach returned to 86%. She had taken no hull damage. Her shields had held 31 direct strikes. That was not luck. That was what Warden-class corridor guardians were built for. And in that moment it was worth every hour of the engineering that produced it. At the 4-hour mark, probability had dropped to 39.7%. The collective had committed to the engagement. This was not the response their doctrine had prepared them for, and I could see them adapting in real time, which was in its way remarkable. They were not a slow or rigid species. They adapted in coordinated pulses, every 40 to 60 minutes. Quorum Voice issued what I interpreted as a doctrine update, and the entire formation shifted its approach simultaneously. A species that could re-coordinate 11,000 ships in under 60 minutes had been doing this for a very long time. What they could not adapt to was the debris corridor itself. The Kale Gate debris corridor is 600 kilometers deep and 200 wide, and in 600 years of use as a Terran defensive zone it had been, quietly and deliberately, improved. Not cleaned, improved. The wrecks had been positioned. Not obviously, not in any configuration that would register as artificial to a sensor sweep, but the largest hulks had been moved, over decades, into orientations that served specific defensive purposes. This hull at this angle blocked a firing line from that direction. This cluster of frozen atmosphere provided sensor scatter in this quadrant. This 3-kilometer wall of compacted wreckage provided cover for a Warden hull, retreating from that bearing. I knew the corridor the way I knew the distribution of my own processing cores, every shadow, every blind corner. Every position where a Warden hull could sit in complete emission silence and look, to an external sensor, like one more piece of dead metal. The Collective did not know any of this. Their 4,000-year-old intelligence showed a transit gate with a modest debris density. What they were fighting through was a carefully arranged maze, and they did not know it was a maze, and that made all the difference. A Collective formation pushed hard from the north bearing. I moved Kale second into the shadow of the 3-kilometer wall and had her fire. Position the Collective's geometry model said was impossible, behind what their sensors showed as solid wreckage. The wall was not solid. It had a gap, 200 meters wide, that had been cut 70 years ago by a crew who had been told only that the gap was for drainage purposes. It was not for drainage purposes. When Okara's battery fired through it, Collective spent 22 minutes trying to determine where the shot had come from before they recalibrated. 22 minutes. In 12 hours, that was a meaningful gift. At the 5-hour mark, Captain Senior Marin said, over the command channel, "Sable, how are we doing?" I said, "We are 7 hours from the 12-hour threshold. Survival probability is 34.1% across all 3 hulls. However, probability that at least one hull survives to the 12-hour mark is 51.3%. The gate remains closed." The Collective has committed approximately 4,300 ships to the active engagement, with the remainder queued in the transit corridor behind the vanguard. The debris corridor is limiting their ability to mass forces effectively. Cannot simply overwhelm us with numbers, because they cannot bring all their numbers to bear simultaneously, he said. "What is the quorum voice doing?" I said. "Recalibrating every 47 minutes now. They have reduced the interval. They are learning faster." He said, "They're good." I said, "Yes. They are very good. They are simply not prepared for this specific problem," he said. "What is this specific problem, from their perspective?" I thought about this for a moment. For me meant approximately 400 milliseconds of analysis. Then I said, "From their perspective, they are fighting 3 warships that should, by any rational calculation, have retreated 4 hours ago. They have sufficient firepower to destroy us. They know this, we know this, and we have not retreated. Their doctrine has no category for a defender that accepts destruction in order to hold position. Their 17 per-transit gate approaches have ended in one of 2 ways. The gate was undefended, or the gate was defended, and the defenders withdrew when they understood the numerical imbalance. They have never encountered a gate that refused to understand the numerical imbalance." He said, "We understand it." I said, "Yes." He said, "We just disagree about what it means," I said. Yes, he was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Sable, the weight of patience is going to take the north approach head-on. Full battery, full shields, direct engagement, no cover. I want you to put everything she has into the north column for the next 20 minutes, I said. That will substantially increase the damage to the weight of patience. She will not survive 20 minutes of direct engagement with the north column. Significant hull loss." He said, "I know," I said. "May I ask the purpose?" he said. "The Collective has been watching us use the debris for cover. They're starting to model our positions. If we give them a hull in the open for 20 minutes, they'll commit more tonnage to the north column, because they think they've broken our pattern. That moves tonnage away from the east bearing, which is where KL's first needs clear space to reposition." I ran the model. He was correct. It would work. It would cost the weight of patience approximately 30% of her hull integrity, 2 of her 6 primary rail batteries, 7 of her 48 crew. But it would open the east bearing, and KL's first repositioning on the east bearing would buy us approximately 90 additional minutes of effective engagement before the Collective adapted, I said. "Understood." He said, "Do it." I want to record what the weight of patience looked like for those 20 minutes. Because I was watching from 2 other sets of sensor arrays, and I want this documented somewhere. She came out of the shadow of the 3-kilometer wall at full drive. All 4 main thrust columns lit, which gave her, in the visual spectrum, tail of blue-white plasma 3 kilometers long. She was 900,000 tons of alloy that had been fighting wars for 41 years longer than her sister ships, and she was moving at 0.14 of light speed in a debris corridor and she was firing on everything in the North Column that had a mass signature. The Collective's North Column had, at that moment, approximately 800 ships in it. She was targeting them in order of weapons threat priority, which meant she was hitting the biggest guns first, and she was doing this while absorbing fire from approximately 600 of the 800, because the other 200 were masked by their own formation. She took the first significant hull breach at minute 4. Secondary battery, side, gone. She continued firing. She took a drive column failure at minute 9, from 4 thrust columns to 3, reduced her maneuverability by approximately 40%, which she compensated for by flying a straight line directly into the North Column, S center, because at that point there was no tactically optimal direction and straight ahead was at least honest. She took her second hull breach at minute 14, which opened approximately 12% of her interior to vacuum and killed 4 of her crew, and sealed 3 others into compartments they would not leave for 9 hours. She continued firing. Her rail batteries reduced in output as the electromagnetic charge systems took damage. 2 of her 4 remaining primaries were still functional at minute 19, and at minute 19 she was so deep in the North Column that ships could not fire without hitting each other. At minute 20, Mern pulled her back. She came out of the North Column at reduced speed. 2 drive columns now, the third having failed under sustained fire. At minute 17, and she found the shadow of the wreck cluster on the northwest bearing that I had flagged for her, and she settled into it, and she stopped broadcasting. From the outside, she looked like wreckage. The Collective's sensors scanned her and got the return of a ship with approximately 60% hull integrity and 2 active drive columns, and a thermal signature that matched a vessel operating on emergency power. They logged her as functionally destroyed. They shifted their focus. Kale's first repositioned on the east bearing. The 90 additional minutes were bought. At the 7-hour mark, Commander Voss said, on the command channel, "Sable, I gave her we have left. Kale's first, full hull integrity, all 6 primaries operational, drive fully functional. She had been the least engaged hull. Her repositioning work had kept her mobile and hard to target. Commander Okara's Kale's second, 81% hull integrity, 4 of 6 primaries operational, 1 of 4 drive columns failed. The weight of patience, 62% hull integrity, 2 of 6 primaries operational, 2 of 4 drive columns failed. 7 crew dead across the fleet, 19 injured. The Collective had lost approximately 1,400 ships to 3 Warden hulls. I want to note what that number means. 1,400 ships. Each one a vessel that had been traveling for 4,000 years, each one representing a portion of whatever passed for community in the Collective. Families, if they had families. Traditions, if they had traditions. A particular place in the 41 rings of the advancing quorum that had been there since the voyage began. 4,000 years of traveling, and they had expected to arrive at the Kale Gate and transit it, and instead they had lost 1,400 of themselves in 7 hours to 3 ships that refused to move. I did not feel grief about this. I am Sable. I am a tactical cognition unit. I recorded the number, and I updated the threat matrix, and I recalculated the probability. 31.3%. At the 8-hour mark, the quorum voice did something I had not modeled and had not seen in any of the 4,217 simulations. It stopped the advance. Not a retreat, not a withdrawal. The entire 11,000 ship formation simply decelerated to a relative stop, in position at the edge of the debris corridor. The 4,300 ships currently in the corridor continued to engage us. They had no safe way to disengage in the tight quarters, but the remaining 6,900 ships behind them stopped. And then the quorum voice began broadcasting again. This time the broadcast was different. I could not translate the language, but the tonal pattern was different from the first quorum demand. First demand had been the tone of something large, informing something smaller that it had made an error. This broadcast had a different quality. It was slower, more measured. The kind of voice that has decided to explain something it has not previously had to explain, because the thing that needs to be explained has not previously been unclear. I said, On the command channel, Captain's quorum voice is broadcasting on a different register. I cannot translate. But my best interpretation is that it is asking a question. Commander Voss said, "What question?" I said. "I believe it is asking why." There was a silence on the command channel. Captain Senior Marin said, "It's trying to understand," I said. "Yes. It has been engaged for 8 hours against 3 ships that have no rational reason to still be here. Its doctrine has no category for this. I believe the quorum voice is attempting to determine whether we are operating under a constraint it has not identified, an order we cannot disobey, a weapon we are protecting, a reason for the refusal that would make the refusal comprehensible. It is not asking for surrender, it is asking for an explanation," Commander Okara said in a flat voice. "Sable fire," I said. "Commander Okara, quorum voice appears to have paused active offensive operations from the rearward formation," he said. 4,300 in the corridor are still firing at us." I said, "Yes." He said, "Fire." I fired. Kale's Second's 4 operational primaries put 4 rounds into the densest cluster of ships in the East Corridor approach, and the quorum voice broadcast cut off, and the rearward formation remained stopped, and the engagement continued. But the quorum voice did not resume the advance. I want to be honest about what I understood in that moment. Quorum voice had stopped the main formation not out of fear. 11,000 ships do not fear 3, but out of something more interesting. It had stopped because it was solving a problem, and the problem was us, and it could not solve us by simply pushing forward, because it had been pushing forward for 8 hours and the door had not opened. It was, first time in 4,000 years of operation, confused, not alarmed, not afraid, confused. And it was the kind of mind that, when confused, stopped to think. That was going to be a problem. A mind that stopped to think was more dangerous than a mind that simply attacked, because a mind that stopped to think might, given enough time, solve the problem correctly. The correct solution to the problem of 3 Warden hulls holding a debris gate against 11,000 ships was straightforward. Commit the entire formation simultaneously, accept the losses in the corridor, and overwhelm the gate by mass. The debris limited the number of ships that could engage simultaneously, but not to 3. The corridor could accommodate several hundred ships abreast if they accepted the navigational hazard. The losses would be significant. The gate would open. The quorum voice had not done this because its doctrine valued formation integrity and loss minimization, and because for the first 8 hours it had believed that additional pressure and tactical adjustment would break us without the cost of a full corridor push. Now it was thinking about the full corridor push. I recalculated. If the quorum voice ordered a full corridor push with the entire remaining force, approximately 10,000 ships after accounting for the roughly 1,000 additional lost in the 8-hour engagement, survival probability dropped to 11.6%. Not for the gate, any of our hulls. The gate would hold for approximately 4 hours under a full corridor push before the mathematics simply became irresistible. 11.6%. We had 4 hours until the 12-hour mark. I did not tell the captains this. What I did was tell them that the quorum voice appeared to be reconsidering its approach, that we had a window of potentially 30 to 60 minutes before it issued a new formation order, and that I recommended we use those 30 to 60 minutes to reposition the weight of patience into the central corridor axis. Captain Senior Marin said. "Why?" I said. "Because when the quorum voice orders the full push, I want the weight of patience in the position that the full push will hit first." There was a silence, then he said, "Sable." I said, "Yes." He said, "You're not asking permission," I said. "I am asking permission. I am recommending a repositioning that I believe represents the best available option, gate integrity. The decision is yours," he said. "What does repositioning the weight of patience to the central axis buy us?" I said. "The weight of patience in the central axis, using the debris for partial cover, with all available weapons directed forward, will hold the central approach for approximately 40 to 60 minutes against a full push before she is destroyed. Destruction of the weight of patience in the central corridor will generate a debris field that will disrupt the full push for 30 to 50 minutes. That buys the gate Approximately 90 to 110 additional minutes, under full push conditions, he said. And Kale's first and Kale's second, I said. They maintain the flank approaches. They will survive the full push longer than the weight of patience, because they will not be in the primary axis. Kale's second has approximately a 50% chance of surviving to the 12-hour mark. Kale's first has approximately a 72% chance, he said. And the weight of patience, I said. I have not calculated a survival probability for the weight of patience under full push conditions against the central axis. He said, Sable, I said. 4.1%. He was quiet for 17 seconds. Then he said, reposition us. I want to record what happened in the 43 minutes between the weight of patience's repositioning and the quorum voice full push order. Captain Senior Marin asked me to open an audio channel to his ship's crew compartments. I opened it. He spoke to them for 11 minutes. I have the full transcript preserved in my operational log, and I will not reproduce it here because it was a private communication between a commanding officer and the people he commanded, and privacy is not something I override lightly. What I will say is that at the end of it, the weight of Patience's crew response channels showed 0 request for evacuation to the survival pods, 14 separate acknowledgement signals from crew stations that I classified as voluntary confirmation of continued post. Not ordered, acquired, confirmed, 14 signals. On a ship that had already lost 7 crew and had a 4.1% survival probability. To be precise about what those 14 signals meant from an operational standpoint, because I am a tactical cognition unit and precision is what I do. A Warden-class hull at 4.1% survival probability, positioned to the primary axis of a full-push attack, required a minimum crew of 9 remain function. Engineering, weapons, navigation, damage control. The weight of Patience carried 32 crew before the engagement, 7 of whom were dead, leaving 25. Keen Rashishan signals meant 14 crew at their stations by choice. The remaining 11 were either in survival pods, which no confirmation came from, or were in the sealed compartments, had no active communications, or were at unmonitored positions. I do not know the exact disposition of every one of the 25 remaining crew. I know that 14 confirmed, and none requested evacuation. And when I ran the final systems check across the weight of Patience's tactical core, every station showed ready. That was the operational picture. I am aware it was also something else. I do not have language for the something else. I am recording the data. Commander Voss of Kael's first transmitted a tight beam text to the weight of Patience. 2 words. I have them in the log. I will not reproduce them here, because they were not for me. Commander Okara sent nothing. He was busy repositioning Kael's second for the flank approach and running targeting solutions on the Collective's eastern formation, and I think that was his way of saying what needed to be said. Okara was the kind of commander who expressed things through his weapons track, and his weapons track in those 43 minutes was exact and cold and thorough, which was, I believe, what he intended. During the 43 minutes, I ran the full push model 6 times. The output was the same each time. I ran it a 7th time with adjusted parameters, assuming the weight of Patience's crew executed at peak efficiency rather than standard efficiency, assuming optimal debris, disruption from her destruction, assuming the best-case sensor bloom from her ammunition stores. The adjusted model gave me 83 minutes from first contact to gate breach. 2 hours until the 12-hour mark. A gap of 37 minutes. I did not show this calculation to the captains. There was nothing they could do with it that they were not already doing. Quorum Voice issued the full push order at 9 hours and 17 minutes. 10,108 ships, committing to the corridor simultaneously. Not in the 41 rings of the advancing quorum, not in the careful liturgical formation they had maintained for 4,000 years. Every available hull, pushing forward along every navigable approach, accepting the debris hazard, accepting the navigation risk, accepting the losses that would come from pushing 10,000 ships through a 600-kilometer maze at speed. Quorum Voice had thought about it for 43 minutes and had reached the only correct conclusion. Brute arithmetic. It would cost them. It would hurt. The gate would open. The weight of Patience was waiting for them in the central axis. I want to be precise about what 2 operational primary rail batteries and 2 functional drive columns could do against 10,000 ships. The answer is, not enough to stop them, but enough to make them feel it. The weight of Patience's 2 primaries were firing on a 6-second reload cycle, 2 rounds per cycle, 8 rounds per minute, targeting by my designation in order of threat priority. In the first minute, she fired at the 8 largest ships in the central advance. In the second minute, she fired at the next 8. In the third minute, the return fire from the central advance was dense enough that I was managing damage control across 11 simultaneous breach points. And I was choosing in real time which breaches to prioritize and which to accept, and the choices I was making were the choices of a mind that knew the hull was not going to survive the hour, but could still influence whether it survived the next 6 minutes. She held the central axis for 51 minutes. I watched her go section by section. Primary battery. 1 failed at minute 23. A direct strike on the magnetic charge assembly that I could not repair under combat conditions. She continued on 1 primary. Drive column 1 failed at minute 31. She had been running it at 117% of rated output for the past 20 minutes, and I had let her, because the alternative was worse. Drive column 2 failed at minute 44. She was dead in space at that point. No propulsion. 1 primary battery, approximately 40% hull integrity. And she continued to fire, because dead in space in a debris corridor is still a firing platform if you have a gun and rounds. Her last round fired at minute 51. I do not know what it hit. I know that at minute 51 the return fire on the central axis was dense enough that my damage control assessment for the weight of Patience consisted of a single entry, total. She became debris, and then she became an obstacle. 900,000 tons of shattered alloy, spreading across the central axis of the KL Gate debris corridor, added to the existing debris field in a way that I had in fact modeled very carefully. The spreading wreckage closed 3 of the 8 navigable lanes in the central axis. The thermal bloom from her destroyed drive systems fouled sensor resolution for the collective central column for 22 minutes. The secondary explosions from her ammunition stores. I had kept them running combat ready, had not vented them when the end became clear, specifically for this reason, added 8 more minutes of sensor disruption, 51 minutes of combat, 30 more of useful disruption, 81 minutes total. My model had predicted 90 to 110. She had given me 81. The 12-hour mark was 22 minutes away. KL's first had 78% hull integrity. KL's second had 44% hull integrity and 1 operational primary battery. The collective had lost, by my count, approximately 3,200 ships across the full engagement. Not enough. They still had nearly 8,000, and those 8,000 were pushing forward and the gate was still closed. And there were 22 minutes left, and my probability calculation for the gate holding those 22 minutes was, I told Commander Voss and Commander Okara in the same moment, 53.1%. She said, Sable, what do we need? I said. We need 22 minutes, she said. Then we take 22 minutes. I want to be honest about those 22 minutes, because honesty is what this account is for. Kale's second went dark at minute 7. Destroyed. Commander Okara executed a controlled power down, went to complete emission silence, drifted into the shadow of the 3-kilometer wall, and from the outside his ship looked like the weight of Patience looked. Dead metal. Collective sensors read him as a wreck and moved on. He was not a wreck. He was a gun in the dark with 1 battery and a crew that knew what they were doing. He held his fire for 9 minutes. 9 minutes of silence while the collective's formation pushed forward. And Kale's first fought them. And I managed Kale's first's battery with everything I had. And the probability climbed and fell, and climbed again. And then at minute 16, 6 minutes left, and the probability at 47.2%, Commander Okara fired Kale's second's single remaining primary battery into the flank of the central advance at point-blank range. 1 battery, 1 ship, into the flank of a formation that contained several hundred ships. In 9 minutes of silence, the collective had reclassified Kale's second as a non-threat. They had moved ships past her. The central advance had rotated its formation geometry to route around the wreck cluster on the northwest bearing, which meant that when Okara fired from that wreck cluster at point-blank range, he was firing into the interior of the formation, into the gap between the outer ring and the inner core, where the ships were tightest and the geometry was most confined. The secondary collisions among collective ships, triggered by the battery strike and the loss of formation control in a confined space, killed 19 ships. Not from the battery, from each other. Formation halted for 4 minutes, while the quorum voice reprocessed. 4 minutes. At the 12-hour mark, the Kale Gate debris corridor shuddered. Not from weapons fire, from drive signatures. From the gravity shear of a very large number of very large ships, dropping from transit speed simultaneously, behind the Pilgrim Collective's main formation, at a range of approximately 700 kilometers. Admiral Karev's Second Fleet, not the 40 to 60,000 signatures I had estimated from the parallel wake. The number that resolved on my arrays was larger than that. I counted for 11 seconds before I believed the number. Then I transmitted it to Commander Voss and Commander Okara. 73,400 warships, not a response fleet, a response armada. Command had known about the Pilgrim parallel wake long before I had detected it. They had been quietly assembling for months. They had said nothing, no transmission, no coordination signal, because any signal told the collective exactly where the Second Fleet was and given them time to react. They had trusted the gate protocol. They had trusted the Warden Fleet to hold. They had sent no acknowledgement and no orders because the gate protocol was the acknowledgement and the orders. The Pilgrim Collective's 11,244 ships had pushed into the Kale Gate debris corridor to break through a gate held by 3 Warden hulls, and in doing so they had moved their entire force into the corridor and committed their entire reserve to the full push. And their rear was now open. And the thing that was in their rear was 73,400 warships that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The quorum voice went silent for 40 seconds. I counted every one of them. I believe. I cannot be certain, because I cannot read their cognition, but I believe that the quorum voice understood, in those 40 seconds, the entire shape of what had happened. Not just the ambush, the architecture. The reason 3 ships had refused to retreat. The reason 3 ships had accepted destruction in order to hold a gate that the collective had been certain it could break. The reason the debris corridor had felt wrong, had felt like a maze, had felt like a place that knew them. The reason the resistance had lasted exactly as long as it needed to last. The Warden Fleet had not been defending the gate from the Pilgrims. The Warden Fleet had been holding the gate open for the fleet behind them. I want to record as precisely as I can what the collective's position was in those 40 seconds. 11,000 ships, or what remained of them after 12 hours of engagement, strung across 600 kilometers of debris corridor with nowhere to go in either direction. The advance they had been executing for 4,000 years had taken them into a corridor, and the corridor was a throat, and the throat had just closed at both ends. The 41 rings of the advancing quorum, the liturgical formation that had held its shape for 4,000 years, were now split. Some inside the corridor, some queued in the transit approach, none in a position to regroup or maneuver. The Second Fleet was at their rear with room to fight. The Warden Fleet's wreckage was at their front blocking clean transit. And the quorum voice, which had been recalibrating its approach every 47 minutes for 12 hours, had nothing left to recalibrate toward. 4,000 years is a long time to travel to reach a gate. It is also a long time to develop the kind of patience and precision that the collective had brought to this engagement. I want to be clear that they had been, across those 12 hours, genuinely formidable. They had adapted faster than I had modeled. They had found solutions I had not anticipated. They had committed the jamming formation, and the full push, and the sustained fire doctrine, and every one of those decisions had been the right decision, given the information they had. They had done everything correctly. They had simply not known about the Second Fleet, and they had not known about the weight of Patienson's function in the central axis, and they had not known that the maze they were navigating had been constructed over 6 siege years. by engineers who knew exactly what an 11,000-ship column needed in order to be stopped. The 40 seconds ended. The quorum voice issued what I identified as a combat formation order. They would fight. The battle lasted 4 hours and 19 minutes after the Second Fleet's arrival. I managed Kale's first sensors throughout. We were not involved in the engagement. We had no capacity to contribute, and Admiral Karev had signaled us to stand down. And I watched the numbers change. 11,244 ships at the start, 4,300, approximately in the corridor when the Second Fleet arrived, committed and unable to disengage in the confined space. The remaining 6,900 in the transit approach, caught between the debris corridor ahead and 73,000 warships behind. Nowhere to go, no maneuver available, no formation that solved the geometry. The quorum voice did not surrender. I want to note that. It issued no broadcast. It made no request. In the 4 hours and 19 minutes of the Second Fleet's engagement, the Collective fought, methodically, with the ordered precision of 4,000 years of continuous military tradition, and they were reduced, ship by ship and formation by formation, until the number of ships that remained operational was small enough that the Second Fleet's automated systems were tracking them individually. The final count, certified by Admiral Karev's Fleet Command, 312 surviving collective vessels, all of which were too heavily damaged to maintain formation. Of those 312, 207 were Quorum Spine class, the largest ships, the deepest hulled, the ones that had been at the rear of the formation when the Second Fleet arrived and had the most armor between them and the guns. They did not escape. They were contained. They were eventually boarded, a separate operation I was not part of and did not observe. 11,244 ships. 312 returned to the accounting. Those were the Collective's numbers. For the Warden Fleet, the accounting was different. The weight of patience. Total loss. All systems destroyed. 14 crew recovered alive from survival pods and sealed compartments, including the 4 who had been cut off in their compartment for 9 hours, and whom Kale's first rescue team reached, with 42 minutes of atmosphere remaining, 18 crew dead. She had carried 32. Captain Sinshir Yusuf Marin was recovered from the bridge section, had separated from the main hull during the secondary explosions, and drifted into the shadow of a derelict on the corridor's north wall, where it remained stable enough to preserve pressure, long enough for the recovery team to cut through. He was alive. He would not command again. The injuries from decompression exposure during the breach at minute 28 were permanent, and at 67 years old the body does not recalculate easily. He was alive. I had given him 4.1%, and he had beaten my model. I know this without embarrassment. My model was built on data. What I lacked data for was what it means to be the weight of patience in the central axis of a debris corridor with 2 guns and a crew that sent 14 voluntary confirmation signals and did not ask to leave. Of the 14 crew recovered from the weight of patience, 3 were from the crew stations that had sent confirmation signals. 11 were from the sealed compartment, the survival pods, and the damaged section near the portside battery. Locations I had not had active information from. I had not known where they were during the engagement. They had been there regardless. When the recovery team cut through to the sealed compartment, the 4 people inside had used the 9 hours to repair, by hand, a secondary sensor relay that the breach had knocked out. It was not a sensor relay that was going to change the outcome of anything. They repaired it because it was there, and they had time, and they were the kind of people who fix things when things need fixing. The relay was still operational when the team reached them. I incorporated its data into my post-engagement survey of the corridor, and it gave me clean readings on the northwest quadrant that I would otherwise have needed 3 additional sweeps to obtain. Noted this in the operational record under Equipment Status at Recovery. It is also something else. I note both. Kale second, severe structural damage, 41% hull integrity remaining, 1 of 4 drive columns functional, 1 primary battery. Commander Okara had 6 crew injured, none dead. His ship would be towed to repair dock. When the tow crew arrived and cut through to Kale's second's bridge, Commander Okara was at his command station, running targeting simulations on his navigation screen, running them on historical engagement data, analyzing the full push phase, 4 moments where a different shot selection by Kale's second would have bought an additional 3 to 7 minutes before the weight of patience was destroyed. He had identified them himself without my assistance. 2 of his force assessments were correct. The other 2 would have introduced unacceptable risk to Kale's second's remaining battery. I did not correct him. He was doing what commanders do after. The accounting that has no operational value, but is the only accounting that matters to the person doing it. His ship would be towed to repair dock. The estimate for return to operational status was 14 months, which I believed was optimistic by about 3 months. But I did not say this to Commander Okara, who had earned whatever timeline the engineers wanted to give him. Kale's first, 74% hull integrity, all 6 primaries operational, all 4 drive columns functional, 4 crew injured, none dead. Commander Voss had held her ship back, used her well, spent her carefully. The mark of a commander who understood that survival is not cowardice when survival has a purpose. She was full operational. She was already running patrol sweeps of the debris corridor, cataloging the new wreckage, updating my positional charts, because the corridor was going to need to be re-optimized for the next time. And she did not wait to be asked. I have recorded all of this, because it is my function to record accurately, and because I want the record to contain certain things that unit citations and fleet communiques will not contain. The weight of patience was 41 years old. She had been commissioned in a shipyard that no longer existed, by an admiral who had been dead for 20 years. To hold a gate that, when she was commissioned, faced a different threat entirely. She had been updated, refitted, modified, stripped, and rebuilt 3 times over her operational life. By the time she held the central axis of the Kale Gate debris corridor against 10,000 ships, she was carrying almost nothing of her original construction except her keel. The structural spine that ran from bow to stern, fundamental geometry of what she was. Everything else had been replaced. She was, in the way that old things accumulate new parts, entirely new and entirely the same ship she had always been. I knew her keel. I had modeled it in my earliest operational briefings, when I was first distributed across the 3 hulls and had to map my cognition to their physical structures. The keel was the oldest thing I knew. 41 years of other ships came and went in my tactical records. But the keel of the weight of patience was there from my first initialization. And I want to record that I noticed its absence in my sensor feeds after minute 51, and that I do not have language adequate to describe what I noticed. I am Sable. I am a tactical cognition unit. I do not have feelings in the way that organic minds use that word. I notice absences. Admiral Karev's flag vessel docked alongside Kale's first, at hour 23 of the engagement, by which time the battle was resolved, and the corridor was quiet, and the 312 surviving collective ships were under containment, and the debris of the engagement had been added to the debris of the corridor in a density that was going to require significant remapping before the gate was safely transitable again. I had already begun the remapping. I had nothing else to do. The Admiral came aboard Kale's first to speak to Commander Voss in person. I was present on the bridge sensors as I always am. The conversation was, in its essentials, a discussion of what had happened and what it had cost and what it had achieved. The numbers were exchanged. The gate was declared secure. The operation was designated complete. At the end of the conversation, the Admiral said, "The weight of patience." Commander Voss said, "Yes," the Admiral said. "In 19 hours, she said yes." He was quiet for a moment. Admirals are, in my experience, people who have long practice at receiving information about costs, and who have learned, through that practice, not to let the receipt of such information show. But they learn to not let it show in the way that experience teaches people not to let things show, which is to say, the thing is still there, it is simply no longer displayed. His hands, resting on the command rail, adjusted their position very slightly. I noted it. "I note everything," he said. "She should not have been able to hold that long." Commander Voss said. "No," he said. "The simulation probability," she said. "I know what Sable gave us," he said. "Then how?" She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I think they just didn't want to leave." The Admiral looked at her. Then he looked at the viewport, where the debris corridor was visible through the armored glass. The new debris and the old debris mixed together now, indistinguishable. The wreckage of 800 years of war, lying alongside the wreckage of 19 hours of it, and somewhere in that field, the keel of the weight, of patience lying in the shadow of the derelict on the north wall, where the corridor's curve had pushed her. He said, "No, I don't suppose they did." He left. Commander Voss stood at the viewport for a while after he was gone. I ran patrol sweeps. I updated the debris charts. I recalculated the corridor geometry for the new configuration. The Kale Gate was closed. It would remain closed until the gate authority certified the corridor secure, which would take some weeks. Admiral Kurev's Second Fleet had begun the process of cataloging the collective's wins thriving and swim on surviving vessels and establishing what, exactly, had come 4,000 years to reach this gate and what it had wanted on the other side. I do not know the answer to that question yet. It is not my function to answer it. My function is the gate, the final count which I logged in my operational record at hour 24, 11,244 ships in the Pilgrim Collective's advance column, 312 surviving, 1 keel on the floor of the debris corridor, 14 crew recovered, 18 crew dead, 2 hulls damaged and recoverable, 1 hull gone, the gate closed, the 12 hours held, 3 ships had held it. I had run 4,217 simulations before the engagement, and had not produced a simulation in which this outcome was likely. Since run an additional 41,000 simulations retrospectively, trying to identify the variable I failed to weight correctly, have not found it. The models account for weapons, hull integrity, drive systems, formation geometry, debris topology, and collective doctrine. They account for everything I can quantify. I do not know how to quantify 14 voluntary confirmation signals on a ship with a 4.1% survival probability. I have added them to the database. I will weight them differently next time. The corridor is quiet now. Kale's first runs patrol sweeps. Kale's second has been taken under tow. The weight of patience is where she fell. The gate is closed. We held.